From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has dusted off her snow boots and headed off to Davos for a succession of big parties and endless panels with world leaders and CEOs in an attempt to drum up investment for the UK. Meanwhile, back at base, her number two, Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, will deliver a speech today outlining Labour's plans to cut benefit bills and government spending.
Whilst you're paying out universal credit to people who want to work but can't work, obviously that is an expensive thing to do.
For both, it's a desperate attempt to balance the books after a rollercoaster week for the markets threw their plans for the economy into jeopardy.
Some records have been broken, not the kind of records that Rachel Reeves would like to hear talk about, because we're talking here about the rate of government borrowing. So just how high are the interest rates that this government is having to pay? And it is up to the highest level since 2008.
And to top things off, a new president in the White House could make things much worse.
I think tariffs are the most beautiful word. I think they're beautiful. It's going to make us rich.
So, do the people who fund the UK's debt have confidence in our ability to pay it back? They didn't under Liz Truss, and we all remember how that ended.
I got a letter this week from a Tory voter in a Labour seat. I hope they don't mind me saying who it was. It was Liz Truss. It wasn't written in green ink, but it might as well have been. She was complaining that saying she'd crashed the economy was damaging her reputation. It was actually crashing the economy that damaged her reputation.
So could we be heading for another Truss-style crash? And does Rachel Reeves have any short-term levers left to pull to boost the economy? The story today. We need to talk about debt.
I'm Dominic O'Connell. I'm the business correspondent on Times Radio.
Dom, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has had a difficult couple of weeks. It felt like the bond market for Britain, gilts were in serious trouble. For you, at what point did you realise this was a proper crisis?
Well, about 10 days ago, at the start of last week, when things really started to roll, it wasn't entirely unexpected because UK bond yields had started to move upwards almost as soon as Labour was elected. They moved again after the budget, and then about 10 days ago, they started to move quite quickly. And I was actually looking at a screen at work, just watching them tick up slowly. These are very small moves, so they're not like share prices, which move in pounds and pence and can move 50% in a day. In the bond markets, things move in very small increments, but a small increment is quite a big deal in the bond market. And over the course of about 2 days, the UK 30-year bond yield went to a bit over 5.8% at one stage, which is the highest I'd been in 25 years. And that is that is a warning sign for any government.
So, Dom, for people who don't watch the bond market very much, just to sort of try and understand what was happening, why we suddenly got to this historic level in the yield, just explain, take us back to square one.
Well, the government has an awful lot of debt. The history of the UK government debt is very interesting because in the early days, it was the process of transferring what had been the King or Queen's debt, because there was no idea of national debt. It was really what the sovereign, and we still talk about sovereign debt, it was about what the sovereign had incurred, normally fighting wars, but often building palaces or whatever it was. And the process of transferring that sovereign debt on to make it a state debt really started around about the time of Henry VIII, but it really got going at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. That's when income tax started to be levied. The Bank of England comes into the picture in 1694. And so then the sovereign's debt becomes the government's debt, becomes everyone's debt, really. So a lot of UK government financial history has been the process of getting into debt, normally by fighting a war, and then trying to find a way to manage that debt afterwards and try and get rid of that debt. And there are three big peaks after the Napoleonic Wars, after the First World War, after the Second World War, and now we're kind of on the fourth, which was caused by another war-style event, fighting COVID. So that leaves the UK with about 2.8 trillion worth of debt. That's the amount the government owes. That number doesn't mean a great deal unless you know what size of economy is supporting it. So the way it's normally expressed is how big is your debt compared to your GDP? We're at about 100%. 100% of our GDP we owe in debt. That's the relative size of the two numbers.
So if this was a household, the amount you make in a year is how much you already owe.
Exactly, is how much you owe. The government takes in about £1 trillion a year in income, mainly almost all from tax. But this year it's spending about 1.3 trillion. This year it's going to have a deficit of about 130 billion. It needs to find 130 billion.
You pointed out that at the moment debt levels are 100%. Well, it's the amount we're making in a year. Our GDP is equal to our debt, which is a terrible position to be in. So basically for any one of us, when we pay our taxes, a huge percentage of that isn't going on better services, it's just going on paying off the interest on the debt.
So the government takes in about 1 trillion, and this year about 112, something like that, billion will go on debt interest, so servicing the existing debt. So that's bigger than the education budget. The NHS and social care budget is only 190 billion, so it's a big chunk of government spending. Roughly a tenth of government spending is going just on the interest bill. And that's money that can't be used for things like public services or defence or whatever it is you want to spend on.
So it may feel like taxes are getting higher, but nothing's actually getting better, and that's partly why.
Well, Reeves is spending more money on the NHS, more on pensioner payments. He's cancelled the winter fuel allowance, but there is more government spending. So in total, government spending is getting a lot bigger, but more and more of that is being used up by debt interest. So
to understand why these interest payments have suddenly been going up, we really have to understand a bit about gilts. So this is the part of the podcast where if you know all of this, just treat it as a drinking game. And if you don't, this is a really interesting glossary. So just explain, because people will hear it a lot in headlines at the moment. What are gilts?
They are, in essence, loans. In the past, governments have just taken out ordinary loans from banks or any other kind of lenders. But for a long time, and certainly since the Second World War, most of it has been done by the issuance of gilts. They're called gilts because they're meant to be gilt-edged, i.e. secure. They're securities that pay a fixed income, 2, 3, 1%, whatever the interest rate is set, and they pay you back your principal after a certain amount of time. So there are 2-year gilts, 5s, 10s, 30s, and their price is set by an auction. And these auctions happen quite frequently, a couple of times a week, and the price that's paid for these gilts at the auction sets government borrowing costs.
So if you and I were to go out and try and buy a bond, just explain the process. What happens at auction?
The auctions are run by an organisation called the Debt Management Office, an agency that does these for the Treasury. Normally, the buyers are specialist brokers or large investors who've registered for the auction, and the people who end up owning them are pension funds, large companies, sovereign wealth funds, so other governments' investment arms, high net worth individuals, or just general fund managers. So you've probably got in your pension some holding of UK government bonds, or gilts as they're called. You almost certainly have. So why would you buy gilts or a bond which pays a fixed income rather than shares? Well, bonds are normally seen as being a safer investment. So if you're running the Church of England pension fund, for example, and you put all the money on Apple, you might be an absolute hero for 5 years when Apple shares go up and up and up. But if Apple goes bust overnight, then no one is going to thank you for having lost the retirement savings of all these vicars. It would be a very, very bad thing to do. So for pension funds, they're great investments. All you really need to worry about is whether the person or government or company who's issued the bond is going to go bust or not.
It's a good bet if you're looking for a bit of certainty from a government like the United Kingdom's, and there's a reason they call it a gilt, as you said. It's gilt-edged certainty about how much you're going to get in the future. So when you turn up at auction, if you're one of the people who can, just explain how the price and the yield get set. What does that mean? How does that come together?
Well, normally the UK government will issue its bonds at par, which will be £1 or 100p, and with a coupon rate, how much interest they're going to pay over the 30 years or the 10 years or the 5 years that they're in issue. So just an example, if you buy a £1 bond and the coupon is 3%, if nothing else changes and you get 3% a year, the yield is 3%. If you buy that bond at 50p, half the price, your yield is suddenly 6%. So if the price goes down, the yield goes up.
And just give us a sense of why the price would go down or why the yield would go up. Is that sort of a bet on where we think government spending is going, government borrowing is going? What's happening? What determines that price?
It's a reflection of people's views of that investment, rather like a share price. If a share price goes down, people think it's not going to pay them as much in the future. Now, with a fixed income like a gilt, the big thing that determines how much you're going to buy it for is the rate of inflation. So if you've bought a gilt that yields 3% and inflation is running at 4%, you're losing money. If it's the other way around and your yield is 4% and inflation is 3%, good, you've got a real return of 1% a year. That's great. So when the yields start to go up, it is normally a reflection of inflation expectations.
So it's a bet on future inflation.
It's a bet on future inflation and your expectations of future inflation.
The UK was already has had a jumpy time in the bond markets for a little while. Some of this does go back to the moment when Liz Truss crashed the economy. Just explain what happened then and why that altered our position in the bond markets.
The whole Liz Truss thing was a wake-up for lots of people about what was really going on in the bond market and also how international investors viewed the UK's creditworthiness. So when Liz Truss was made Prime Minister, she came to power on the promise of some quite reasonably, but not astonishingly radical economic policies. She wanted to cut taxes, restrict government spending a bit, and generally spend lots more money without funding it through taxes. And she published this plan without referring it to one of the institutions of UK government, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is meant to keep budgets and governments in check. If she had been a bit more aware of life, she would have seen that UK bond yields had been creeping up in the previous 6 months. There was a lot of nervousness about a return of inflation after the pandemic and whether there would be an inflation spike. So investors were quite nervous. You sort of have this situation where there is some petrol around, you don't want to be throwing matches at it. And Liz Truss's mini budget, even though she won't see it like that, really did that. It really just sort of set fire to this. And the market's looking for a target, and she really put the target on the UK's back. And the run-up in bond yields was very rapid, about 1.1 percentage points in the space of 3 days. That's a very big move. It doesn't sound like much. That's a very big move for sovereign bond yields.
I've sort of seen the graph, and it's like a vertical spike. Very suddenly, the yield goes up massively, and it hasn't come down since.
Exactly. And at the same time, there was a mini currency crisis. The pound went down to the lowest it had been since the 1970s over that weekend. And adding to this, the other thing she didn't really realise is that there was a hidden underlying crisis with pension funds, who are naturally gilt investors. They had done some quite complicated financial bets that were in essence predicated on interest rates remaining reasonably low and certainly not bond yields not rising quickly, certainly not as quickly. And so they had to start selling bonds, and that pushed, and they'd gone to a bit of a spiral on the bond market where yields were going up and up and up. So Liz Truss now says, well, it was nothing to do with me, it was to do with the secondary crisis in the bond market. The Bank of England had to step in to sort that out.
I put forward what were perfectly rational policies that I won in a leadership election on.
Some people will love those arguments and some people will hate them.
No,
but the reality is that it
But what happened?
Blew up.
What happened, Chris, was that I was undermined by organisations like the Bank of England.
But I think when you're coming to a verdict on chancellors, it's you need to be aware of the situation in which you're acting. I think it's clear from history now that she and Kwasi Kwarteng were not aware of what the prevailing mood was. And second, you rate chancellors and prime ministers on how they deal with crises. And so she did have a crisis on her hands, and she didn't live to really sort it out. In fact, she had to reverse quite quickly. Alistair Darling, who had to deal with a giant crisis in the imminent collapse of the UK banking sector, we remember him as a very good chancellor because he sorted out a problem pretty well.
Yeah, steady nerves. Should we be taking what's been happening over the last week as a verdict on Rachel Reeves and her budget? How much of this is a reflection of confidence in the bet on inflation in this country and on her ability to grow the economy?
I don't think it's quite a verdict on the budget. The bond market verdict on the budget came immediately after the budget.
The scale and seriousness of the situation that we have inherited cannot be underestimated.
When Reeves was speaking, it's quite interesting if you watched it, gilt yields actually fell a tiny bit when she was on her feet because they saw the extra spending, but they saw she'd balanced it with some pretty chunky tax rises.
Means that this budget raises taxes by £40 billion. Any chancellor standing here today would have to face this reality.
And they thought, well, actually, it looks like a fairly conservative budget. It's probably not going to make a great deal of difference. And she talked a lot about growth. Great, we need the GDP to get bigger.
Welcome to the ABR's press conference for our October 2024 economic and fiscal forecasts.
But when she sat down and the Office of Budget Responsibility published its verdict on the budget, bond yields started to rise almost immediately. It wasn't a massive move, but it was a move up.
Against a largely unchanged economic and fiscal backdrop since our last forecast in March, this budget delivers one of the largest increases in spending, tax and borrowing of any fiscal event in history.
The OBR said, despite all the spending, growth is not going to move at all over 5 years.
The net effect of all these changes is to leave the level of GDP higher in the near term, but broadly unchanged in the medium term.
It's not going to do much for growth. And the market saw that and said, well, actually, this is spending which is not going to help the UK's debt sustainability. And our verdict is that, bond yields have to rise.
When she stood up and delivered that budget, one of the things she promised was that tax rises wouldn't be happening again anytime soon. Just explain, with the yields going up, with the cost of borrowing having increased, is she likely to have to backtrack on that? Just explain what's happened on the sort of the government level.
It's probably it is an option that she would have to, but I think it might be political suicide having repeated again that there won't be more tax rises. But because borrowing costs are going up, debt interest is going up, and that leaves her less room against her fiscal targets.
The stability rule means that we will bring the current budget into balance so that we do not borrow to fund day-to-day spending.
And particularly one of her fiscal targets, which is that by 2029, all government day-to-day spending, not investment spending, but just running all the public services, will be paid for out of tax. In the budget, she said she would meet that by £9.9 billion. That's a tiny fraction.
And those targets are important for just reassuring the markets.
And her own political credibility, I think, given she sets so much store by them. So she needs to find some more money, or does she abandon the fiscal target? We don't think she's going to do that. So where does the money come from? It could be from tax rises, but she seems to have ruled that out. So it will almost certainly be a tougher spending review. Spending review to set departmental budgets for the next 5 years is happening this spring. It just means that more departments are going to have to come up with more savings, or at least not spend as much as they thought.
Dom, since that moment last week when yields suddenly shot up and things were looking very bad for the Chancellor, we have had a few bits of good economic news. Just talk us through those.
Yeah, we had inflation, which came in a little bit better than expected. The forecast was for CPI inflation to be 2.6%, and it was a fraction under 2.5%. And we also had GDP numbers for November. The forecast was for growth of 0.2%, and it came in slightly under at 0.1%. So this picture of a stagnating economy. The inflation number was better than expected, which probably explains why yields have eased off a bit. But there could be a bit of a trick in that, because the ONS measured the airfares on funny days in December. They measured them on Christmas Eve and on New Year's Eve, which is normally when people are not travelling so much. So a few economists have pointed this out, and they expect it to jump back up next month. So those inflation numbers could go back the wrong way for Rachel Reeves early next year.
And as you said, the gilt yields are a bet on future inflation. So if there is that sense that inflation might be going up, we can expect the bond market to react.
Exactly. All other things being equal, an increase in inflation makes the bonds you've already bought a little less attractive.
When this crisis was playing out in the news here, and a lot of the country suddenly sat up and realised that things weren't looking great for the bond market and what that meant for government spending and for all of us, really, in terms of our taxes or the way we live, the Chancellor was actually on a plane heading out across the world. Just tell us where she was and why.
She went off to China to drum up some inward investment, or at least to wave the flag for Britain and hopefully get some inward investment deals into the UK. It's always difficult for chancellors to know whether to go on trips or not when there is some speculation around the nation's finances. If you don't go, you may make the crisis worse. If you do go, then you're accused of ignoring the fire at home.
Right, let's get cracking with the opposition. Earlier, I spoke to the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride.
The sight of our Chancellor of the Exchequer scampering off to China, cap in hand, at a time that the UK economy is in significant distress, does not get that balance or that approach right.
Actually, the yields have cooled off a bit. If they'd continued to go up all week, she probably would have copped the flak for it. But I think in this case, she probably did the right thing by continuing with her agenda.
And is this move towards China, is that something that might help our economy?
There's a whole bunch of things that could come this way. There are lots of Chinese investors who may want to put money to work here in the UK.
But we're leaving no stone unturned, which is why last week in China we secured £600 million worth of tangible benefits for the UK economy, helping great British businesses exporting overseas.
I think Rachel Reeves is taking a fairly pragmatic view of it, in the sense that we need the world's second largest economy to invest here if we're going to get growth going. But we don't want Chinese involvement in some of the more sensitive areas like defence technology or technologies that may have a dual use, civil and military.
That's the second largest economy in the world. Some of our problems in the last week or two have also stemmed from our relationship with the biggest economy in the world. We have the inauguration of Donald Trump has just taken place. Talk us through how what's happening in America is affecting us already.
Well, I think there were some very direct effects on UK companies from the first Trump administration. All whiskey makers had to pay high tariffs for exports to the US. That didn't go down very well. It was a problem also for the exporters of automotive goods, so cars, components as well. There were import tariffs on those. So far, it was really not clear what Trump will do. He talks about tariffs as being a fix-all for all kinds of problems, not just economic, but also diplomatic, averting wars.
I have stopped wars with tariffs by saying, you guys want to fight, it's great, but both of you are going to pay tariffs to the United States at 100%. And they have many purposes, tariffs, if properly used. I don't say you use them like a madman. I say properly used.
So it may be that the initial focus of tariffs are not so much on trading partners like the UK, but on countries where he's pursuing different goals, like China and fentanyl, like Mexico and the border, like Canada and the import of opioids as well.
I'm a big believer in tariffs. I think tariffs are the most beautiful word. I think they're beautiful. It's going to make us rich.
With Trump, you never really know, but there is definitely a threat there.
So there's tariffs, obviously, which would push the price of everything, products that are coming from abroad up. What else?
Well, he's also talking about big corporate tax cuts, which would give US companies more firepower to do more stuff, which would normally be inflationary. And also big personal tax cuts, which would put more disposable income in the pockets of US consumers. So that would also be inflationary. Trump's problem is that the US budget deficit is, well, if it's not maxed out, then it's not far off. It's running an annual budget deficit of about 8% of GDP. That's very, very high for peacetime, probably the highest it's ever been in peacetime. So While some of Trump's economic policies may well be inflationary, he can't afford to do too much more government spending. Or at least we think he can't. Maybe he'll want to push the budget deficit even higher. Elon Musk, as the head of this new government efficiency drive, is talking about taking $2 trillion a year out of the US budget. That would be disinflationary. So while there are things out there about Trump's economic policy we think will be inflationary, there are other things that might actually restrain prices.
So it really is just a gamble at the moment. So for Rachel Reeves, she's got all the policy levers that she can employ at the budget in spring to try and combat some of this uncertainty. Some of this is out of her hands, clearly. You know, she can't control what Donald Trump ends up doing. What are the best short-term fixes?
The Sunday Times' economics editor, David Smith, who's been looking at this kind of thing for a lot longer than I have, I think he wrote a book to this effect, Something Will Come Along, which has always been the story of the UK economy, really. So often there's been lots of accidents that have driven things, the City of London being an example. The euro-dollar market didn't exist until the 1970s, came about really as a sort of an offshoot of US tax policy, drove the growth of the City of London. Big time. So all these things come along, and one of the lessons is that central government planning for economic growth often doesn't work. It normally is a much bigger secular trends or accidents that drive stuff going along, and lots of government plans just don't work out at all. So I think perhaps Rachel Reeves, one of the lessons from this budget may be that you can't just say, I'm determined to have growth and it will happen. It's a very long lever to pull on growth. It may produce some results in 5 or 10 years' time. But in the meantime, you really just have to hope that animal spirits will exert themselves and the UK economy will start growing. And to be honest, the lesson of history is that it often does.
We can but hope. That was Dominic O'Connell, business correspondent on Times Radio. Dominic also writes a weekly column for The Times, which you can read every Friday at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producer today was Sam Chantarasak. The executive producer was Fiona Leach. Sound design and theme composition were by Maula Seto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.